Thank you for joining us. Today we have business and executive coaches joining us from all over the world, and we are in the final week of the summit, and it's been very exciting so far. Today's session is Multiple Brain Integration Coaching, how the latest findings in neuroscience are changing the game. The taster session was well attended, and we are in for a real treat as we get into the details of this session. And we'll be discussing the latest findings in neuroscience and the ways that the three functioning brains in our head, heart, and gut work respectively. And remember, to get the most out of this session, you should be listening for actions that you want to take as a result of being here today, and take probably 3 actions within 24 hours of being at this session. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our 2 co-presenters. The first is Marvin Oka, and Marvin is a sought-after international consultant and keynote speaker specializing in leading-edge behavioral change technologies and research. That's a bit of a mouthful. He's also recognized as a world leader and authority in his field, and he has built an impressive track record helping organizations with strategic, systemic, and cultural change. Marvin's clients range from private enterprises to government agencies throughout the world. And our second presenter, our co-presenter, is Grant Suzalu, and Grant has advanced degrees and certifications in psychology, positive psychology, applied physics, computer engineering, and software development. He's a qualified TQM, Total Quality Management trainer. He has achieved Master Practitioner certification in the Behavioral Sciences of Neurolinguistic Programming, which is NLP, and Advanced Behavior Modeling, and more recently Grant was awarded a graduate coaching diploma in the newly emerging field of authentic happiness coaching. So please welcome our 2 guests, Marvin and Grant. Thank you for being here today.
Well, thanks, Sherry. It's fantastic to be here. We're very excited. Grant and I are both very excited to be here because we're very keen to share with everyone some of the latest findings in neuroscience and what we've developed over the last several years, what we call multiple brain integration techniques. What's probably extremely exciting to appreciate, to recognize, is that modern neuroscience today is starting to prove what ancient wisdom traditions have been saying for the last 2,500 to 3,500 years. Now, for anyone listening that were also attended our pre-summit session, it'll be good for you to actually get an overview or a review of a lot of this work that we've been doing. But also, Grant and I want to give you a lot of finer distinctions from what we talked about in that short session earlier, and things that, for those of you that's new to this program, you'll start to become aware of just how powerful these new findings of neuroscience are actually making available to you in terms of new coaching techniques and the profound implications of what it means when a client comes up to you and says things like, well, my head is saying one thing, my heart is saying something else, and my gut wants me to do something else altogether different. Well, as a professional coach, what do you do now? And probably up until recently, we would have just thought of these as just cute little cliches or cute little terms or just little colloquialisms that people typically say. But modern neuroscience is showing that these are not just trivial statements. When people are saying that their head wants to do one thing, their heart wants to do something else, and their gut wants to do something else, there's a very good reason why they're saying that. And it shows up in modern ancient wisdom traditions. When you hear great advice from wisdom traditions saying things such as follow your heart, or to trust your gut instinct, or what it means to actually come from a place of a compassionate way of being in the world. Now, why do so many wisdom traditions say these kinds of things? Why are these so common across so many traditions? And as modern neuroscience is showing, there is a reason for this. And one of the things to appreciate is that the head, heart, and gut are, in fact, bona fide brains. Modern neuroscience is showing we don't have one brain, we have 3. And it's not just in our head. The heart is technically a bona fide brain, as well as is the gut. Both are what are called, the heart and the gut, in addition to the head, are what are called complex adaptive neural networks. As neural networks, they can think, they can process, they can store information, they store memory, and they have neuroplasticity. They learn and adapt. Each are incredibly powerful organisms of learning, of adaptation. Technically, the head is known as the cephalic brain, the heart is known as the cardiac brain, the gut is known as the enteric brain. Grant and I usually just call them the head, heart, and gut brains to make it a bit easier. But what makes a brain a brain? It's important to understand. When Grant and I were first developing this, and we started talking to a lot of people around the world, sharing with them some of the latest research in neuroscience and what it means when you work with all three together, people started to ask us some interesting things, such as, well, why are these called brains? Why are you calling these brains? And Grant and I were quick to point out that we're not calling these brains. Science is calling these brains, and for a technical reason. So I might hand over to Grant. And Grant, if you might want to explain a bit about the neural structure of these different forms of adaptive networks and why they're technically brains.
Absolutely. Thanks, Marvin. And thanks, Sherry, for introducing us before and having us here. So, yeah, the three brains are considered to be brains by the various fields of science that deal with these brains. So with the heart brain, it's neurocardiology. With the enteric brain, there's a field of neurogastroenterology. And there are scientists that work in these fields and have decided that they label these complex adaptive neural networks as brains because they have all of the hallmarks of a brain that is equivalent to what we have in the head brain. So they have not only large numbers of neurons, so number one, a brain needs a large number of neurons, but for example, the eye has a large number of neurons. The eye is not considered to be a brain. The reason is because it doesn't have a huge number of interneurons, which are neurons that connect other neurons together to form complex webs of feed-forward feedback processing. There's also all of the support circuitry that's required, and the glial cells and the other componentry that you find up in the head brain. And equally, all of the neurotransmitters that you find in the head brain are found in the heart and gut brain. And what affects the head brain also affects the heart and gut brain, so that certain disease states, like Alzheimer's, not only affects the neural networks in the head brain, but also in the gut brain, for example.
Now, what's powerful to appreciate is that when a client comes to you and they're wrestling with particular decision issues or life issues or trying to set goals for themselves, whether they're professional goals, personal goals, or whether we're working with a lot of internal issues within themselves about how to make a proper decision or how to sort through a plan or how to just clarify their thoughts, they're probably going to be wrestling with information signals coming from all three of these brains. The head brain is trying to rationalize. The heart brain is trying to figure out what's important and where are their passions, what their values are in play. And the gut brain is trying to appreciate or trying to do things that making sure that things are safe, what to act upon, what not to act upon. And often these signals can be contradictory or can be conflicting if they don't know how to work with and align all three of their brains. And that is what a good multiple brain coach does. Over the years, Grant and I, over the last couple of years, Grant and I start to look at what would it mean to be able to get these three brains integrated, aligned, communicating with each other, so that the person is not only internally congruent, they're internally aligned within themselves, but what happens when they are. And we started to find some remarkable things through a lot of our action research. We started to discover that when these three brains are aligned, people are not only internally congruent, something else happens. They start to come alive. It's like their whole relationship to themselves and to their life starts to blossom, and we get a level of what's called emergence. Something emerges within them that was not predictable at the start of a particular coaching session. And so we find that a good multiple brain integration coach, or an MBIT coach, as we call them, a good trained MBIT coach, first of all, works with all three brains with the client. They help the client get in contact and communication with the signals from each of these three brains so that they can pay attention to not only their head processing, but their heart intuitions and their gut intuitions. And as we know from science, these aren't just airy-fairy terms. These are actually real intuitions. These are real signals coming from the heart and gut intelligences. And then to get these brains aligned, so the person's internally congruent, and then they start to come alive to, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, something we call the highest expressions. Now, Grant and I, you'll hear over the course of this whole webinar, Grant and I will often use the terms brains, intelligences, and neural networks interchangeably. So sometimes we'll call these brains, sometimes we'll say these are intelligence, sometimes they're neural networks. And we've also found that different people, different clients that come into a coaching session, they'll respond to these terms differently. So sometimes you might be able to talk to them about three brains, and some clients will find that interesting and fascinating and will capture their attention. For other people, they might be confused if you call your heart a brain or your gut a brain. However, if you call them an intelligence, your heart intelligence or your gut intelligence, for some reason they're happy with that. They can go with that. For others that are a bit more technically oriented, they'll appreciate it more if you call them neural networks. So we use the terms interchangeably, and sometimes for those of you listening, if you're going to refer to your head, heart, and gut brains with your client, sometimes you might need to change the terms as appropriate to what your client responds to. Now, two things we do want to define very quickly is the way we use our terminology. So you'll have, in the book that we wrote, we called it M-braining. And what we mean by that is the verb form of the brain. So we're saying M for multiple. And how do your multiple brains work together as a process? Hence the verb form, braining. And we use it in two ways. One, the way that someone's currently using their multiple brains. So if a client comes to you during a session, and they're saying they're having all of these internal challenges. They can't find their passion in life or their purpose in life, or they're wrestling with a complex decision. You know, their head is saying rationally I should be doing something here, but my heart really feels it wants something else, and my gut is too afraid or wants to do something else altogether different. We're saying that's the way they are currently doing their M-braining processes. As a good coach, our first step is going to be a bit of a diagnostic to see how are they currently using their three brains in ways that produce, for lack of better terms, their issue or their problem state or their current situation that they want to deal with in the coaching session. We're trying to find out why aren't they able to solve the problem for themselves. How are their three brains not working together? And then we want to get them working together. So we'll still use M-braining processes to align and integrate their multiple brains based on what it is that they're after. How do you do that? Well, we need a range of techniques. This is what we call MBIT, or multiple brain integration techniques. And that's the whole suite of techniques that Grant and I have been developing over the last couple of years of how to help people get their three brains aligned, get them in communication with each other and get alignment. And we deliberately call these techniques. We didn't want to create some sort of philosophical approach or just a generic methodology. We wanted to hold ourselves accountable to say, after we looked at all the science research, can we turn them into practical, learnable, doable techniques that people can actually use to make a difference in their lives? I might hand it back over to Grant to talk about where a lot of this came from. We didn't just pull this out of the air. We actually did quite a bit of extensive research on this, and Grant is by far the scientist between us, and he can give us a much better overview as to where all of this has come from.
Thanks, Marvin. Yeah, just to give you an indication of the sheer amount of research that we did do, and we pulled on well in excess of 1,000 papers and nomographs and articles across the web and across the research journals. But where we really started with this process, and this process was getting neuroscience to inform the process of behavioral modeling. So we're behavioral modelers. What we do is we look for the patterns and processes that underlie the behaviors that people are able to perform repeatedly and work out what that process recipe is. Typically in the past, behavioral modeling has been done without neuroscience informing its basis. So the first thing we did was we went to the neuroscience and we looked for what was the evidence across the literature. And we looked at embryological and development evidence, evolutionary phylogenetic evidence. We also looked at surgical evidence. For example, if we look at something like the head brain and the history of of our understandings from a scientific perspective of what goes on in the head brain, before we had functional MRI and PET and other abilities to look inside the brain while it's operating, psychology and science initially looked for pathology and disease evidence, surgical evidence. So if somebody had had a stroke or somebody had cancer or somebody had been in a car accident and had, for example, left frontal pole injury, we looked at what were the deficits and the changes in their behaviours and in their psychology, in their personality. The paradigmatic example in psychology of this is a gentleman by the name of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was preparing a hole to do some blasting in a tunnel for the railroad back in the 1800s, and he accidentally sparked off with his tamping rod the explosives, and it drove up through his frontal pole, this tamping rod, and took out his left frontal pole of his frontal lobes of his brain. He survived that devastating injury, and in fact he was able to hold down jobs and continue on with his life and lived for many, many years after that horrific injury. But people who knew Phineas Gage said he was no longer Phineas. And what specifically had changed was very particular behavioural indicators of his personality. So what Marva and I did was we looked for pathology and disease evidence and surgical evidence of the gut and the heart. For example, gastric banding. There are operations that are performed for gastric banding to help people control and their weight loss. And there has actually been studies that have been done, longitudinal studies, of people who've had gastric banding and what personalities changes have occurred in these people. So we looked at all of this, including cognitive linguistic evidence, neuro-linguistic evidence, and then we went modelling and looking at the ancient wisdom evidence, esoteric field evidence. So all of that pulled together produced a wide swag of factors, and then we did common factor analysis on all these to determine what were the core competencies of each of these neural networks, what were the prime functions, and how did these behaviours play out in human excellence and human experience.
What's fascinating is over the years, Grant and I, we've been colleagues for well over 20 years, and every so often, Grant and I would have these dinners throughout the year, and Grant, being such an amazing scientist and an amazing researcher, he'd be telling me at every dinner some of the latest things he's been discovering and how science has been discovering the heart brain and the gut brain, and I'd be absolutely fascinated. And Grant and I, being both behavioral modelers, we saw the instant implications and applications to personal development and professional development. So over dinners, we'd be talking a lot about pulling from all these different fields of evidence and saying, oh, the implications are tremendous for people. This explains a lot of these types of issues, or this has now implications for new possibilities in new ways for leadership or new ways of parenting or all sorts of applications. And then one day it slowly occurred to me, and I called Grant up right away as soon as I realized what was going on, and I said, so Grant, these dinner conversations we've been having, when we've been pulling together all of these different domains of evidence, and we've been synthesizing them from a behavioral modeler's perspective about the implications and applications for human development, are we saying that no one's done that before? Science has only looked in their specific domains of technical expertise, but no one's really pulled together what does it mean for a human being when the head, heart, and gut are aligned, when they're totally congruent based on what science is saying and what we're seeing out there in the real world. And he's saying, yeah, this is exactly the point. So that gave us then the stimulus for us to work together over the last several years to pull a lot of this together. And as Grant has just said, so much has come from a lot of science-based evidence, but also at the same time, as we said earlier, science is showing what wisdom traditions have been saying for 2,500 to 3,500 years. Now, I highly suspect that there's going to be many of our listeners here today that have some sort of background in some sort of wisdom tradition. You might practice some various forms of meditation or some form of yoga. Many coaches are familiar with the approach called the Enneagram or Taoist breathing practices, and it's amazing how many of them, if not, as far as we can tell, actually, to be quite frank, we haven't found an exception yet where there has been a wisdom tradition that hasn't referenced some aspect of the head, heart, and gut intelligences. And comparative studies have shown that it is more the norm rather than the exception that wisdom traditions reference 3 souls or 3 forms of intelligence, not 1. And when we start to analyze what are these 3 forms that they do reference, it seems to have high correlations to the head, heart, and gut neural networks. And so we've combined a range of things, from wisdom traditions to taking a look at what neuroscience is saying. Grant and I did some very active action research groups. We pulled together people. We tested our ideas and thoughts and techniques and theories to see what would work. We looked at behavioral modeling cases where we said, well, who can do what, why, and let's start to examine what's occurring if they're unconscious processing to find out what the correlations are to the head, heart, and gut. And as Grant has mentioned, we looked at a lot of different case studies on neurophysiology and functional disorders. And we started to see that a lot of the information started to cohere into some very clear patterns. Now, we'd like to highlight for our listeners here, what are some of these patterns? Because one of the first set of powerful distinctions we began to uncover was that not only do we have different neural networks in our head, heart, and gut, that these 3 are actually bona fide brains, but these brains do different things. And because they do different things, it starts to explain why a lot of your clients, or maybe even yourself personally, at times in your life, have internal conflict between your head, heart, and gut. Because they're trying to do different things. And if they're not doing it in alignment with each other, then we're going to have internal incongruencies. But when they are aligned, then a whole set of personal empowerment, a new level of personal empowerment starts to arise, and a new quality of being starts to arise as well. But first, let's explore what these functions are. One way to actually get a sense of this is let's take a look at some of the common sayings people have whenever they refer to the head intelligence. So let's take a look at this. What are some things that you would probably typically understand? Well, or use yourself in some terminologies, in some ways of phrasing language. And people say these kinds of things. Now, if we take a look at these types of phrases, these phrases are referring to what kind of internal processing? So if we say someone wasn't using his or her head, what do we mean by that? We're not saying, we know intuitively that this kind of phrase doesn't mean the person wasn't connected to their feelings. Or when they say, where's your head at? They're not asking you what your deep set of values are. They're asking you what your thoughts are. They're asking you what your logic is. Where's your rationale for this? If we say someone's lost his or her head, we're not saying, well, they're disconnected from their feelings. We're saying, well, they've lost their rational thought. And so interesting, when we look at the common phrases of what people say around the head brain, it gives us some clues as to what internal processing is actually going on for people. Now let's contrast that. Let's contrast that with common sayings that people have about the heart. What do people say when they refer to heart in their language? Well, these are some of the sayings, by no means comprehensive list. But when we take a look at them, these kinds of phrases refer to what other kinds of processes, very different in contrast to the head. So if someone says have a heart, or they wore their heart on a sleeve, or they have a broken heart, we don't mean their logic is irrational. We're saying it's about feelings. It's about emotions. So when someone has a heart-to-heart conversation with you, they're not saying, well, let's debate about it logically. They're saying, no, let's have an emotional connection together. And so right off the bat, and again, this is not just in Western culture. This is across cultures. We find very, very common sayings that when people are referring to the head or referring to the heart, they are referring to very different processing. And this is also, you're going to pick it up with your clients as well. When your clients come in and they start using head-based language or heart-based language, this is language directly representing the kinds of internal processing that they're wrestling with or dealing with. And as a coach, this should give you some clues as to how you need to work with them. Now, once again, let's contrast that with common sayings of the gut. What do people say whenever they're referring to gut in their language? Now, again, the gut is not just the stomach. It's the entire gastrointestinal tract, all the way up from the mouth, all the way down to the anus. We're going to find a whole range of language patterns referring to every part of that whole system. And so when someone says things about, I have a gut instinct on this, or go with your gut, what are they saying? What do they mean when they say that? Well, we get some other clues. When someone says things like, well, you need to have the guts to do something, it's saying you've got to have what? You've got to have the courage to act. You've got to have the capacity to overcome some fear and to act anyway. Or if someone says, I can't stomach it, or it's hard to swallow, what are they saying? They're referring to things where I can't digest that. I can't take that into me. It's hard for me to actually make that part of me. Well, this is all giving us clues as to what the gut intelligence does, what that brain is particularly good at. When people say things like, I've got butterflies in my stomach, if you have to, for many people, for a lot of our listeners, I would assume, if you said, great, we're going to have to speak to 100 people, some of you will get pretty excited. Many of our listeners will be presenters in their own right. But others might still find that, public speaking is still their number one fear, so they would get butterflies in the stomach. So why does fear and anxiety get processed in the stomach? What is it that the stomach does with all of that? Well, let's start to explore what we mean by this. This is one of the first set of distinctions that Grant and I began to glean out of the information, combination of what science is saying and the behavioral modeling of what people typically say and do, and also our own action research. And we sort of find each of these different brains are good at different things. The head obviously is good at cognition. It can recognize things into awareness. It can perceive things. And it's good at thinking processes. It's good at problem solving, analysis, decision making, or decision making is actually quite a complex process, but it's good at analysis, synthesis, sorting things out, organizing. It's also good at making meaning. The language centers are in the head brain. And so it's good at coming up with story and narrative. So for the coaches that are listening, if you work with things like narrative therapy or using cognitive behavioral therapy or things of that nature, you're good at helping people use their language centers better in order to actually create a storyline, a narrative that works better for them and challenge any dysfunctional stories. But the heart is very different. The heart is good at your emoting processes or processing your emotions. And so when people are saying, well, it's just interesting, when Grant and I were first developing MBIT, we had an opportunity to do a keynote speech in Sydney, Australia. And I happened to follow at that time someone who was very big in the neurosciences. And she was doing a lot of things on the neuroscience of leadership, the neuroscience of peak performance. And interesting, a lot of her research was really based on the head brain. And so she referred to a much older model that still is around these days called the triune brain theory. Which then highlights that, for our listeners that may be familiar with it, if you're not, it suggests that we've got 3 different brains all up in the head brain. So there's the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and the neo-mammalian brain, all up in the head brain. And if you only look at the head, they end up saying, well, the emotional processing is all in the limbic system, all in the head brain. And she kept talking about how your emotional processing was there in the limbic system. And I had to follow her, and I had to find out some way how to diplomatically relate to the audience that the emotional processing, when you actually are processing your emotions, it's not actually occurring in your limbic system. It's actually occurring in your heart intelligence. It's just that where the head signal, where it sends signals back up to the head for the head to process it, shows up in that limbic area. A classic example, this classic behavioral modeling, and as listeners, you can relate to this intuitively yourself right now. If I go to someone, anyone, I don't care what culture it is around the world, and I've said, if you deeply feel something, when you have a deep set of feelings about someone, or you really care about someone, or you're passionate about something, or you have a deep set of emotions, point to where in your body you feel it. Nobody points to the limbic system in their head. Everybody points to either some aspect of their torso or chest area. Somewhere in their body is where they're processing a lot of their deep emotions. And it makes sense because a lot of your heart neural network is where it's happening. It's also responsible for your values, your valuing processes. And so this is where heart intelligence, emotional intelligence, comes into play in good decision making. That if you're trying to make a decision, and if you're not connected to your heart intelligence, which means you're not connected to what is important to you about the decision. You can't appreciate your processes for valuing something one above the other. Then how do you make a decision based on priorities or what's truly important if you're not connected to your heart? If it's only your head can make meaning out of anything. And it does. It'll make meaning out of anything. It'll make meaning out of nothing. Nothing's going on in your head will still make meaning out of it. If you only lift your head can rationalize anything. It's amazing. In fact, Grant, you might want to explain this piece of research that Grant discovered, quite fascinating, about what happens when people can get creative in their head but not connected to their heart and the problems that happens.
I'm not entirely certain which piece of research you're referring to.
The one about being creative and what happens when you get creative but you're not.
Oh my God, yeah. That was quite an incredible piece of research that I came across only in the last month or two, and it comes out of the field of behavioral economics. And it was based on the checking for the behaviours that people do around prosocial emotions and whether or not people will be honest or dishonest. And they found that as soon as they got subjects to do any sort of cognitive-based process, whether that was doing a logic problem, whether it was just adding up some numbers or doing a mathematics problem, that it increased the amount of dishonest behaviour and decreased the amount of prosocial behaviour. So people actually were less likely to be kind and considerate to others, and were more likely to, even to the point of stealing money from the experimenters in the experimental protocol, by just getting people to do logic, so head-based first rather than heart-based first. Fascinating.
Now, yeah, the significance of this is quite profound, which is if the head and heart, and as we'll talk about in just a moment, if the head, heart, and gut are not aligned and not working together, the head can make meaning. It can come up with a storyline to justify anything. And we see it today in corporate businesses that can come up with all sorts of decisions that really, if you look at it, would have to be in some classes clearly unethical, if not immoral, if not it's out and out illegal. There are times when we start to see all sorts of decisions or actions being made that if you couldn't have made those decisions if you were really connected to core values or connected to people, what we call relational affect, how you feel about someone in a relationship. Unless you're connected to people with your relational affect, your feeling about someone, the feeling that you are connected to people, the feeling that how much you appreciate a relationship, if that's not there, guiding the decisions, guiding the storyline that the head's coming up with, the head can justify practically any behavior. And this comes down to the gut brain. The gut brain is particularly good at preserving your core identity. Now, it was interesting, about 80% plus of your immune system is done via your gut brain, via your gut neural networks. And what's your immune system there to do? It's there to figure out, well, what is you and what is not you. And what is not you, the immune system sends out antibodies to go get rid of it. Your digestion system has to decide, not so much analytically decide, but it sorts out what things it will assimilate into you, it will digest and assimilate into you, and what things it needs to excrete from you. It's also good at self-preservation, so fear, boundary, protection, safety issues are particularly good at the gut. That's why we feel anxiety and fear in the stomach. That's why we get the butterflies in the stomach. Or when someone is in a danger situation and their gut instinct saves them. In many ways, martial artists all learn how to train from the gut, from the hara, from the lower belly. And as a result, also mobilization. Your gut's particularly good at getting you to go into action. And so it's when someone's frozen with fear, it's the gut response that can stop you from doing it, but it's the gut that gets you to take action. Again, we hear it in language. Someone needs the guts to take action, or someone needs they need to have the intestinal fortitude to act. And so these three right off the bat clarify a lot of client issues that may be showing up in your coaching sessions. When a client, and now you can start to understand very clearly, when a client says, my head says I should be doing something, which is a thinking, making, meaning type of an issue. They got rules. But my heart really wants to, emotions and valuing, do something else. But my gut is too scared to act, self-preservation, mobilization. Right? Or it's not me, and I'm not sure if I'm capable, so I've got an identity issue. And so we can start to see right off the bat why a client might be having a lot of internal challenges and what needs to happen, where you need to address the particular issue and which intelligence. And this is why you can't analyze from the head your way into a purpose and passion in life, because that's a heart-based intelligence. You're not gonna think your way into your passion or your sense of purpose. Or your head is not going to convince your gut to go into action when your gut is in fear mode or self-preservation mode. The gut has to feel more secure before a different storyline can start to appear for your client. Now, what might get in the way? Why don't clients just, when they show up, why can't they just align themselves? Why do they need to come to a coach? Well, it seems that there's some constraints. Grant and I began to discover some common ways in which what would prevent the three brains from integrating. And as a coach, you need to know these, because this is kind of what you need to work with in a coaching session. What can happen is one or two of the intelligences are used, and one or two of the other intelligences don't have a voice in a decision. And we see this a lot, and again, as I mentioned before, for those of you that are executive coaches or business coaches, many times the business world is run by a head-gut type of a relationship. The gut has instincts on what it wants to do, wants to act. You have a bias for action in the Western world. The head comes up with all sorts of stories to act or not act, and often the heart doesn't have a voice in some of those decisions. And when that happens, you'll see it in organizations. When a majority of executive decisions are missing the heart element in their decisions, you're going to have all sorts of people problems in the organization, ranging from staff engagement, cultural problems, communication problems, and it will show up as leadership problems as well. Sometimes we'll find that one or two of the intelligences just simply overrides the others. The difference between 1 and 2 is in number 1. One or two of the intelligences don't have a voice. They don't even show up in the decision or actions. But in number 2, what happens is there is a voice, but it gets overridden. So the heart says, I really want to do this in my life. And the head says, shut up, that's not, that's silly, that doesn't make any sense. And the gut is saying, oh yeah, be quiet, we're doing this instead. So the voice gets overridden when that happens. Sometimes we also find that intelligence is used to inappropriately do the job of the other one. We see this often with things such as emotional eating, for instance. Someone is feeling emotionally unfulfilled, so therefore it shows up in their behaviors as overeating. And so what happens is the gut is now trying to make the person emotionally feel better, wherein the gut doesn't process the emotions. The gut can get satiated by having enough food, but it's not going to fulfill the emotional requirements of the person. Sometimes there is direct conflict between the head, heart, and gut, and now the coach really has to go to work and sort out some of these challenges and issues. And sometimes they work together in the wrong sequence. And we'll explain that sequence component a little bit later in a few minutes' time. And very early on as well, Grant and I realized, well, we could come up with a whole range of techniques, a whole range of different multiple brain integration techniques. But people will need a roadmap. In a coaching situation, how exactly do we work with our client with the three brains? Well, it's so we pulled together what we call the roadmap. And the first step when working with a client when they come to you, when they've got an issue that they can't resolve for themselves, and it seems to be arising from some set of internal conflict between their head, heart, and gut, one of the first things that has to happen is you've got to help your client get in communication, starting from the bottom, get in communication with their three brains regarding any decision, any plan, any issue that they're working on. First, what does your head really have to say? What does your heart really have to say about this? And what does your gut really have to say about this? And having to tap into those intuitions, into those signals, neural signals. Then we need to work with the client to get them aligned, internally congruent within themselves. Once they're internally congruent, we find that we can help the client become more authentic in their expression of who they are in the world. Now that they're internally aligned, how do they actually now really express themselves in their highest form of who they are, in their way of being? It's an ontological, a way of being coaching. And here we find the highest expressions show up in a set of patterns that we call highest expressions of creativity, compassion, and courage. Now, you could use different words for those of you listening, but we chose these for very specific reasons. Again, I might hand over to Grant as to how we came up with these words. Actually, Grant came up with these beautiful words because he discovered them in some of his studies.
And I'll just wait until that slide comes up so I can see the words that we're talking about.
Let's look at the highest expressions.
The highest expressions, of course. So with the highest expressions of courage, compassion, and creativity, they actually came about in a rather fascinating way because many, many, many years ago I'd read a book on Tibetan Bonpo religion, which is the religion that predates Buddhism in Tibet. And what I read in there was they said that a person could have been considered to live a truly wise life if they'd mastered three things. And these three things were compassion, creativity, and courage. I love that sort of 3C model so much that I wrote it down on a piece of paper and stuck it on my desk in front of me where I sit even as we speak. And it would get lost in my pile of interesting material, and every year or two I would come across it again and go, yes, that's it. I've got to live more from these three virtues. They are quite amazing. And then when we're doing the research and doing the common factor analysis of the three brains and looking for what were the core competencies and the functions of each of the brains, and what cohered out of that, we were looking at it and going, there appears to be something that is actually very flow state, very positive and very adaptive as compared to less adaptive or more maladaptive ways in which these three neural networks can work, and we'll be talking about that shortly, autonomic mode. But within those, when you look, you can say, if you looked at each of the brains and said, what was one thing that really came out of each of these brains as being the most adaptive of what each brain does, and how would that map across to what wisdom traditions were saying? What popped out was compassion, creativity, and courage. And at that point I remembered, oh my goodness, this is something I've seen before. So I went across and went searching for this piece of paper that was more than 8 years old, sitting in this pile on my desk, and lo and behold, it's what has been shared with the world more than 3,000 years ago, which was what the Bonpo religion had been saying, which was compassion in the heart, creativity in the head, and courage in the gut. And there is a sequence, and the sequence counts.
It's interesting. We start to see these words, again, in different forms, but sometimes these are very exact words showing up, again, across many wisdom traditions, and now showing up even in business literature, showing how leaders need to actually come from a state of compassion, and how compassionate organizations actually are far more productive than those that are purely task-driven. And again, the need for creativity and the need for courage. And we're using these words in very specific ways. For instance, by creativity, we don't mean lateral thinking, and we don't mean innovation. We literally mean the capacity to create, to actually come from a place of nothing, to create something out into the world, and also to have compassion, which means more than just feeling for someone else. Compassion requires compassionate acts. We need to see a sense of service, a sense of being able to serve and help the needs of others. And courage, the capacity to act despite conditioning, despite all the social constraints that say, why status quo, you need to succumb to status quo. And this becomes really the structure of great leadership. And one of the reasons why highest expressions are an expression of self is they all require each other to do what they do. Compassion that is not creative can be dumb compassion. You can actually make things worse by just simply rescuing or saving things rather than helping people learn, helping them grow. And what is the most compassionate thing to do that is intelligent? At the same time, it needs to be creative, and it needs to have courage, because if you don't have the courage to act, then no compassion ever got expressed, so nothing compassionate ever really happened. Creativity requires compassion. As Grant mentioned earlier, if you're not connected to people and your creativity is not one of service, then you can end up being a very innovative cheater, someone who cheats and steals creatively. But again, similarly, if creativity is not manifested in the world through courage, well, then nothing got created. And once again, courage, you can have dumb courage or you can have smart courage. So courage requires creativity, an intelligent form of courage, but a courage that is compassionate, a courage that it does something out in the world that makes the world better, compassionate for self, compassionate for others, but courageous enough to get past any conditioning from just succumbing to status quo if the status quo is not satisfactory. And we find that when people are coming from their highest expressions of an authentic way of being, an emergent sense of wisdom starts to arise. A wisdom, when you're working with your client, you'll find that when you do multiple brain integration work with your client, the wisdom with which they come up with how they want to approach their original challenge or issue is often is 90% plus of the time, it's dramatically different than what they originally started the coaching session with. Because the problem state, the problem consciousness that they come into your coaching session with comes from a consciousness of non-integration that arises from non-integration of their three brains. When their three brains are aligned and they're coming from highest expression, oftentimes the original problem can be irrelevant. They start to find, now that I know what's true for myself, the real thing is actually this, not the thing I originally came in with. Or they'll end up with something that is so totally unpredictable. I remember Grant and I were working with someone once during one of our coaching certification programs, and the lady was working on a business challenge she was having to do with getting her coaching association or coaching organization having some sort of government accreditation here in Australia. And she was wrestling with it, figuring out how to actually deal with it. And once we got her aligned into her highest expression, we asked her, well, so what's actually the real issue for you? And she came back with forgiveness. We all went, what? It was quite stunning, but it was nothing to do with what her original problem was, her original presenting issue. Where it really came was something had to do with her heart and her gut that was holding her back. And when she was able to actually release that, bang, she became amazingly congruent, and her sense of self began to bloom from there. So again, this is where we start to see the emergent wisdom elements come into play. And so these highest expressions are so critical. We're going to find that when your clients come to you, they're often going to be wrestling with some sort of compassion from the heart for themselves. They're beating themselves up, or they're judging themselves, or whatever it might be. Or they need to have a sense of connection with others in order to serve. They need to get creative about it. And they need to have a sense of courage about how to actually succumb a lot of their limiting beliefs, limiting conditioning, whatever it might be. So this is a very big leverage point. And we find leadership, with executive coaching, leaders are constantly wrestling with these three forms of things. Grant and I, when we were once speaking with, when we were starting to first get MBIT out there into the world, we spoke with a gentleman here in Melbourne. His name's Brad Krauskopf. He's the CEO of a group here called The Hub. But The Hub is a social entrepreneurial network. They're big onto collaborative innovation through technology. They are a global franchise out of Denmark, I believe, out of Copenhagen, and big on social entrepreneurism. And when we explained these highest expressions and prime functions to Brad, one of Brad's comments back, he said, yes, he said, the reason why he, from his view, why more organizations are not socially entrepreneurial is because they're not connected. And by that, he didn't mean internet connected. He meant heart connected. And he went on to say, if they were connected, they would be more socially entrepreneurial. And Grant and I thought about it. Of course they would be. If you actually if your leadership came from a sense of compassion, meaning, let me be connected to my customers, let me be connected to the community I serve, let me be connected to the people that are in my organization. Let me be compassionate. Where are their needs? Where can I serve? Of course you would be more socially entrepreneurial. You wouldn't just go for bottom line profits. It's not all about total shareholder return. It's about, for lack of better terms, what Richard Branson would say, doing good in the world. That doing good in the world is good for business. And if you read, in fact, Richard Branson's latest book on Screw Business as Usual, it's all about social entrepreneurism, global social entrepreneurism, and it all starts from exactly this, the highest expressions. It starts from compassion in the heart, connected to people, then be creative as a leader, envision new possibilities of how to express that compassion in the world, and then have the courage to buck the status quo and act upon your convictions, act upon what's true for you. And this is going to happen for your clients as well. Whether it's a personal problem in a relationship, they need to have compassion for self, compassion for the other. Be creative in how they want to approach the situation. Have the courage to overcome their limiting condition, the conditioning, and to come from a higher form of real authentic way of expressing themselves in that relationship. Or the same for parenting, or the same for a business situation, whatever it might be. Now you'll be noticing I'm talking about a specific sequence, and I'll explain that sequence in just a moment. But first, we need to explain this very quickly, because it's very difficult for your client to actually get in contact with their three brains and get them aligned if they're in the state of what's called autonomic imbalance. So again, I might hand over to Grant for the subtle clue here is for a quick explanation of how this works.
Yes, exactly. I'm noticing the time, so we're really going to move through this fairly quickly. But I just want to point out that this fairly detailed diagram is all about the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system is autonomic, it's automatic, it drives all of the functions that you normally don't have to do conscious awareness on. It has two arms, and these two arms, sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic, you think stress, so it's the high energy, it gets you moving whenever there's a stressor. It's the fight and flight response. But when the danger's gone away, the parasympathetic, which is the rest and repose, and the feeding and fornicating arms, it's the life-affirming, bringing you back to balance. And these work, they're separable systems, but they work in counterbalance typically, but they don't always have to. And you can get situations where you are either sympathetic dominant, parasympathetic dominant, beautifully in balance, or what's called coherence between the two arms, or you can get a state where both sympathetic and parasympathetic, where the accelerator of the car and the brake of the car are both pushed hard to the boards. They're both on at the same time, and this creates what's called a metastable state. You see people flicking from one to the other very, very quickly.
So this is actually very critical. If your client comes into you and they're overly sympathetic or stressed, it'll be very difficult for them to tap into their heart and gut intuitions, and their head stories will be running rampant. If they're overly parasympathetic, they'll come in with a bit of depression, apathy, lethargy, and they're having a heavy gravity day, and it's very difficult for them, again, to get in touch with their heart and gut intuitions. We need to get these into balance, and as Grant has said, a highly coherent state. Well, how do we do that? Well, it's kind of interesting. Science research shows the heart is actually responsible for maintaining that balance. But here's the first challenge. Wait a minute. If it's an autonomic, it's part of the autonomic system, so it's outside of our awareness and it's running autonomously, and the heart is responsible, well, how do we work with that? What do we do with that? Well, fortunately, there's a very simple technique that you can teach your clients that helps them get into autonomic balance that then allows them to tap into their heart and gut intuitions and get their head, heart, and guts aligned. And believe it or not, it's as simple as breathing. So particularly diaphragmatic breathing. So a lot of the research is showing that a simple process of regulating your inhalation and exhalation, and more specifically, roughly a cycle of about 6 seconds of an inhalation, 6 seconds of an exhalation. You do that repeatedly, keeping the inhalation and exhalation even, breathing through the diaphragm, starts to put someone into a state of autonomic balance, literally within seconds, inside of 60 seconds. We do this now in our coach certifications, and we hook people up to a biofeedback machine where you can actually see what's called their heart rate variability, and we can teach people to actually go from a state of either stress or depression, not clinical depression obviously, but a state of stress anxiety or slight depression, and move them into a state of autonomic balance and coherence, literally inside of 60 seconds once they know the breathing technique. And interestingly enough, all wisdom traditions throughout the last 3,500 years, all wisdom traditions have some form of a breathing practice, whether implicit or explicit. Whether it's something explicit like pranayama breathing methods out of yoga, or to other philosophies that have more things around chanting or mantras that start to regulate the breathing pattern. Why? Because it's science. What happens is when you breathe in a particular way, you can actually either stimulate the autonomic nervous system, depress it, or get it into balance. And so the first step moving up the roadmap is get your clients into autonomic balance. Teach them a very simple breathing process. Our MVIT coaches constantly report back the power of putting a client into a breathing pattern and then an autonomic balance at the start of a coaching session makes a world of difference in the coaching results. Trying to coach someone if you're trying to coach through a stress state or through a depressed state, it is way too hard. First step is get them into balance. Then they can move up the roadmap. Last thing we're going to talk about at this point in time is what we call the sequence. You will have noticed in the conversations that Grant and I have been saying, I've been talking to you about, there's an order in which we work with our brains, and it's not starting from the head. Borrowing from traditional Chinese medicine, a great phrase, they'll often say the heart is the emperor. So we start working with our clients through the heart. Let's first get them connected to what's true for them in the heart. From that place, let's help them create stories, make meaning, interpret their issues and challenges, but from a values-based heart connection. What's important to them about the issue? Now create a narrative and a story that's going to be meaningful for you. Bring that back down to the heart. Let the heart appreciate and value these new thoughts about how you could be, how you could do things different. Then bring that down into the gut so the gut can act upon these new thoughts because they're important. And then bring that back up to the heart so the heart can appreciate and value these courses of actions. Again, we could spend the next hour just talking about the foundational sequence, but we won't. We're out of time. But Grant and I did want to give this to you because it is such an important way to work with your clients. The sequence in which your client works with their three brains, or the way you work with your client's three brains, can make all the difference in the world. I love this quote to end up. We love this quote by Stephen Jobs, as he points out. If you look at what Stephen is saying in his language patterns, he is already referencing the heart and the gut as distinct from the head. And as you see in that second to that last line, he's also already saying they're an intelligence unto themselves, and when you tap into them, an authentic way of being starts to emerge. This is what he was trying to get at in his quote. And again, neuroscience is again proving what many of us intuitively know, but now we have so much more precision with it, and it's showing what ancient wisdom traditions have been saying for over 3,500 years. So it's a beautiful thing. We live in a great world as ancient wisdom meets modern neuroscience. The implications for you as professional coaches are just profound. And so we hope this has added some value for you, and maybe we can toss back to Sherry and find out, Sherry, do we have any questions from anyone that we can address at this point in time?
Well, we definitely have questions, and even though I have paid attention to this during the taster session and looked at the slides, every time I hear this, my brain and my heart and my gut are all wowed by this, so thank you very much. Yes, let's see, we have a few questions, and one of them is really having to do in a coaching scenario. How would you coach your client so that you can align these three brains in a way that they can be more congruent and activate their inner wisdom?
Brilliant question, because it's it's a practical one. It's what at the end of the day, what as a coach, what do we do with this? And in our coach certifications, we spend 4 days teaching people how to actually do this. But to give you the short story, the short template on it, first thing we need to do is we explain to the client, if it's a new client, particularly if it's a business client in particular, we need to explain to them the difference between a multiple brain coaching session versus a traditional behavioral coaching session. With multiple brain coaching sessions, we're working with their multiple brains. We talk to them about how science has proven that they're 3 brains, so it paces their logical, rational mind, that this is not airy-fairy, new age stuff, that is actually well steeped in science. We'll talk to them about a breathing pattern, and we'll often hook them up to the biofeedback machine so they can actually see the impact of their breathing patterns and how it reaches autonomic balance. When that happens, they're pretty well convinced that all of this is great stuff. But even without that, the first step is we elicit from the client what they want to work on. We gather some information. We take a look at the way they're currently using their 3 brains to create their problem state. We get them breathing 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out, so they can calm their system down. They can then tap into their intuitions. And we go up the roadmap. We say, great, regarding your issue, what does your heart really have to say about this? What does your gut really have to say about this? And now, given that, what does your head really have to say about this? And we go in that order, from the heart to the gut, then to the head. So now we get a truer sense of what's true for them about the issue as opposed to their reactive responses. Then we use the foundational sequence. We say, what's important to you about this issue? And we breathe that in through the foundational sequence, and we move that through their heart, then to their head, then back to the heart, down to the gut, back to the heart. Then we take them into the highest expressions. We coach them into accessing ways of being that are compassionate, creative, and courageous. And from there, let's now relook at what their issue was or what they wanted to work on at the start, and often by that time, it's dramatically changed. So that's the basic process.
That's pretty intense, and thank you for that. The next question.
Sherry, I'll just jump in there and say that if people need to know or want to know more about this in any detail, they can grab a copy of our book, Embraining. It is available up on Amazon. It's also available as Kindle, so they could grab that. It goes through what Marvin just said in a lot of detail.
That's right, and I will just send through the link so they could read more about each of you, and there is a link to your book on your personal pages on the WBECS site as well. So the next question really has to do with dealing with the gut, but it has to do with recognizing within your client how they can understand their internal challenges and actually deal, this question specifically is dealing with the gut brain.
Okay, first thing, it helps to appreciate the prime functions of the gut brain and what it does. So when you know that, you now need to listen to your clients. So when they're first telling you about what their challenges are, we spend an entire day with our coaches when we're teaching them how to do coaching on how to do what we call calibrate your client, which is how to pay attention to the nonverbal cues and signals that your client is giving you that's indicating how they're using their multiple brains. And in gut, often one of the first things you'll see is direct gestures to the gut. Their hand gestures will go, if they're saying, well, I don't know, I'm feeling really stuck and I can't find a way to actually move forward with my particular issue. And you watch, a lot of their hand gestures will go down to their gut, which is telling you, oh, okay, unconsciously, they're actually telling you where they're feeling this, where the processing is, and they're showing that the gut is active. Listen to what we call their predicates, their language patterns. And they will say things that are either directly gut-related or metaphoric. So they'll say things like, I'm finding it hard, I've got this thing going on, and I'm finding it hard to swallow, or it's hard for me to digest these changes that's occurring. Or they say things like, and they'll often use scatological language. So this issue really gives me the and you kind of go, well, okay, they're saying the issue is giving them something that they would rather excrete rather than take in into themselves. And there's giving great clues. The gut is active here. Right? So we start to pay attention to the way that they're using their gut. Now, when they use their language, pay attention to which prime functions are they talking about. Are they talking about core identity issues? Are they talking about safety, protection, fear issues? Are they talking about ability to act or not act type of an issue? And again, they're telling you which gut prime functions are actually now in play. Now, majority of times, people will either have identity type issues in play, things that are not me. I can't do this because it's not me, or I'm not good enough, or whatever it might be. We've got a core identity problem. Or it's a fear-based issue, anxiety. They're hesitant to do something. They're scared to do something, whatever it might be. And often the first thing, when that's in play, the first thing you've got to do with your client is get a feeling of safety. As long as the gut is feeling unsafe, it's going to go in defense mode. It's probably going to go into sympathetic mode and go into stress, anxiety responses, fight or flight responses. And at that point, it will be very difficult for them to tap into their inner wisdom. So first step is breathe. First step is let's get them autonomically balanced. Let's make sure that the gut is feeling a sense of safety, safe enough that we can now start to work on their issues. So the first step is we've got to get the gut feeling safe and secure, and then we can actually start to go to work.
Wow, that's excellent. And that actually applies not just in a coaching situation, but I think in your own personal life, in all of your relationships. When you understand that, you can have better relationships because you know what is at play and how that person is reacting and what they're reacting from. So that's excellent.
Yeah, exactly.
And and just to let you know, we've received lots of superlative comments like tremendous, phenomenal, super in the chat area and the questions. So, and I thank everybody for your comments. And we'll just take a couple more questions before we wrap up today. And the next question has to do with the neural integration. How do you help give the heart a voice, or one of the other intelligences that is overridden?
Yeah, this is a great question, because gosh, this is just so common for so many clients that will come in, where it's just one of the neural networks just doesn't have a voice. Again, very similarly, the first thing you've got to do, everything starts, as we said in the roadmap, starts with autonomic balance. We're not going to get anywhere if the client is in a stress state or a depressed state. When they're in those states, what you're going to get is conditioning. You're going to get conditioned reactive responses. So breathing, back to a state of autonomic balance. Then, oftentimes, if there's anything that's going to prevent the heart having a voice, it'll be one of two things. Either the gut is in too much fear, and so therefore we need to calm it down, get it breathing, or the head is just going crazy with what Buddhists would call the monkey mind. It's just got a storyline that just won't quit. Right? Internal dialogue is just running rampant. Now, what is fascinating is this state of mindfulness. Many of our listeners will be familiar with working with mindfulness, and some of you out there might actually be mindfulness coaches. Interestingly enough, there are different parts of the brain, of the head brain in particular, that produce different forms of awareness. So if you're predominantly working with a lot of signals coming from the front part of your brain as opposed to the back part of your brain, you can get caught up in a lot of your internal story, and therefore the heart never, in this case, an example, the heart doesn't even get a voice. But interestingly enough, if you calm down, if you breathe, and you start to calm down, and then as you continue your breathing pattern, you actually place your awareness to the back part of your head brain. You'll start to notice something interesting, which is you'll actually be able to notice your internal dialogue. You'll actually be able to notice the thoughts that your head's coming up with, and you can actually be slightly dissociated, or our language, what we call meta, to your own thoughts. You've got a state of metacognition. You can actually notice the head running rampant on your storyline. That's often going to be a first step for a lot of people. Once you can do that, and just let the stories run in your head, but you maintain a state of mindful awareness, we can now ask the heart, what do you really feel about the situation? Even though the story's going on, but I'm in a different state of awareness where I can now tap into the heart and literally ask it, as long as you're in an autonomically balanced state, you ask the heart. One of the language patterns we teach our coaches is to ask questions like, what does the heart really feel? Not the reactive emotion, but given all that, what does the heart really feel? What's really important? A values-based question. What's really important to the heart? And pay attention to the heart signals. And the heart and gut have different language. It won't talk to you in full sentences. It'll talk to you in general feelings or images, or it might talk to you in symbolism and different types of metaphors will come into mind. So you've got to pay attention to what is the language of the heart and the language of the gut. But when you do, then the heart brings voice. And once we have that, Now we can build it into integration and congruence. If that's what's important to the heart, now the foundational sequences will have power. Let's start there. From there, let's change the stories in the head. From there, let's inform with how the gut needs to act and upgrade a person's identity accordingly.
That's fantastic.
On top of that, which is that the intuitive literature would also say that it's the small, quiet voice.
Yes.
So when you ask those questions of what does the heart truly want, or what does the heart truly value, you have to stop. You need that silence, that still point, to listen for the small, quiet voice.
Fantastic. And one of our audience members said, this sounds similar to heart math. Is some of your work related to the work that they do at Heart Math?
Very much so. In fact, I might let Grant talk about this because Grant's very much in touch with Heart Math.
Excellent.
Yeah. Actually, we've linked strongly with Heart Math, and we went across to one of the conferences they had over in Europe, in Italy, this time last year. They're meeting again at Villa Zuccari in Umbria, even as we speak. And Bruce Cryer, the global director, has said that embraining is profound work, and he believes it brings the work that Heart Math have done on the heart that aligns it with this, the work that's been coming forth about the gut-brain that Heart Math really don't connect with. They really, their focus is around heart-head, and what we're bringing is the heart, head, and gut all in alignment. But absolutely, Heart Math love what we're doing.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And our last question is actually about your own research. Someone has asked if you could tell us more about your action research groups.
Yeah, it depends what they'd like to know. What we do is we did it quite extensively in the initial build-up of it, and we continue to do it when we've got some interesting other things we want to test out. But what we do is we use our networks to pull together a group of willing people, so they know they're coming for a research group, and we basically try out ideas. We've got different techniques we'll try out, or we'll test something and see what the reaction is, or we'll find people that are able to do certain kinds of things, and we'll do some behavioral modeling processes to see what's occurring. So, and we found out all sorts of interesting things. Like in our past group, we had a mix in one of our action research groups. We had a mix, obviously, of not only different genders but different generations, different age groups. And we found an interesting thing. We were doing the things around highest expressions, and we were testing the highest expressions to see how well people responded to the compassion, creativity, and courage, and whether or not this was really a deep highest expression or not. And we had a guy there that was his job was as a DJ. He was a Gen Y generation, and he was a DJ, and he had a lot of challenges tapping into the compassion component. And he then articulated to us afterwards that he said he just realized that he actually doesn't have any personal history, any experiential reference related to that word. When he thinks back, when he sees the word compassion or hears the word compassion, when he thinks of his whole history, he has no link between that word to anything he's experienced in his life. Which is fascinating. This is really, really amazing. And so we started realizing, well, sometimes we need to use different words, etc. It's not that he has no reference of compassion. He just doesn't have that particular language label linked to it. But it gave us some clues as to how we need to help facilitate now people with this. We developed a thing that we call NICE, Neural Integrative Engagements, things that enhance the signal strength between the heart and gut, head, heart, and gut. And we were trying to use different things like colors and movement and different forms of imagery. And out of our action research groups, one of the people said they couldn't do it with colors. They didn't find anything. But when they imagined compassion, creativity, and courage as jewels, then they could do it. We went, jewels? How about that? So we realized that gave us clues on how we needed to modify how the different techniques we could use to help amplify signal strength between the head, heart, and gut for alignment. And so, again, not quite sure exactly what was wanted in the question, but in terms of process and procedure, we go to networks. We organize people that they know they're coming to an action research group. It's deliberately framed that way. It is pure experimentation. We give them some overview as to what we're working on. We try out techniques. We see what's happening. We see what works, what doesn't work, and that fuels us for. It either validates our thoughts or it contradicts it and we've got to go back to the drawing board, or it spurs on new things we want to actually research.
Wow, that is amazing. I really would like to participate in one of those groups. They sound great. Now, we've run out of time here today, but I'd like to encourage people to go to our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/WBECS, and you can ask questions there. And I've also put in the chat area the links to the individual pages for Marvin and Grant, so you can learn more about them and get access to their book as well. And I thank both of you so much for this fantastic session today.
Great, thank you, Sherry. It's an honor to be part of it.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. Really appreciate it.
It's great. Thanks, everybody, for participating, and we'll see you in the next session as well. And don't forget, go to the Facebook page, and we can continue the conversation there. Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.